Winter of 1887. The wind from Crowknife Pass slashed down into Frostjaw Basin like an invisible blade. Down in the valley, several cabins stood shrouded in a dead, terrifying silence. Their chimneys choked, unable to release a single wisp of smoke. And the main doors had already been sealed solid by frost from the inside. In stark contrast, higher up on the northern slope, a rounded mound of snow, the very thing the villagers had mocked as the ice tomb, was quietly breathing, exhaling a thin, stubborn ribbon of smoke into the suffocating dark. Inside that tomb, Bram Calder remained awake. His eyes were locked on the tiny, glowing embers inside the clay firebox. Reaching out, he adjusted the draft, making the small flame even smaller. On the raised, sleeping shelf, his wife, Mara, held their 7-year-old son, Nolan. The boy stirred, his voice small in the dark. "Pa, is the storm going to bury us?" "No," Bram answered, his voice low and thick with calm. "The wind is just out there looking for a fight. We aren't giving it one. Go to sleep." Nolan closed his eyes, burying himself deeper into the warm fur of Tova, their Alaskan Malamute. The dog's breath was a gentle, almost invisible mist, not the frantic, thick white clouds of freezing distress. Outside the snow wall, the mercury in the thermometer hanging from a cedar post bottomed out at negative 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Nature was delivering its silent judgment, and, ironically, the place they called an ice tomb was the only thing left breathing. 3 months earlier, Frostjaw Basin had been busy preparing for another northern winter. Fresh pine logs disappeared beneath rising cabin walls. Wood piles grew taller every afternoon. Loose shingles were nailed down before the first heavy snow could arrive. Instead of joining the others, Bram Calder guided a sled toward the empty northern slope. Tova leaned into the harness, dragging bundles of rawhide across wind-packed snow, while Mara walked beside Nolan through the bitter cold. Sheriff Abel Rook watched the family climb higher and finally called after them. "Planning to build a shed?" Bram stopped long enough to answer. "A home." The reply earned puzzled looks. Reverend Silas Morrow studied the open hillside, then shifted his eyes toward Mara. "No wife or child belongs inside a hole cut into snow," he said quietly. "That's not a home. That's an ice tomb." A few settlers laughed. Mara heard every word. She simply pulled Nolan's scarf a little tighter and continued walking beside her husband as Bram knelt and pressed an elk-bone probe into the frozen snow without another word. The decision had not come from stubbornness. Years earlier, Bram had traveled with a winter survey crew across northern Montana, where cold exposed mistakes long before spring ever could. One abandoned cabin still stood with every wall intact, yet 3 men had died inside after a hard wind forced smoke back through the chimney. Fire had never touched the logs. During that same season, the very same aging trapper, Old Nels Arvik, had survived the cold by digging his living space lower than the entrance and sleeping on a raised platform above the settled air. Bram never claimed to understand every northern tradition, but those lessons never left him. Cold always searched for the lowest place. Warm air climbed if nothing disturbed it. A roaring fire often solved one problem while quietly creating another. Jonas Pike, the settlement's most respected cabin builder, folded his arms as Bram marked the first snow blocks. A proper wall should still be standing after spring. Bram looked across the frozen basin before answering. "I only need mine to stand through February." Bram ignored the smooth drifts that had collected beside the cabins. They looked clean, bright, and easy to cut, but he walked past every one of them. Crowknife Pass was where he stopped. The wind had hammered the snow there for weeks, packing it into something neither soft nor solid. Old Nell's elk-bone probe disappeared too easily through one drift. Bram moved on. Another patch felt like stone, sending the tip back against his palm. That one was useless too. Only after several more tests did he find what he wanted. The probe entered with steady resistance. When his old hay knife sliced into the block, a dry, whispering sound followed the blade. Nolan frowned. Why not use the softer snow? Bram lifted the finished block onto the sled. "Soft snow looks strong," he said. "It isn't." Harlan Creed, the owner of Frostjaw Basin's small sawmill, laughed from the trail below. "Now he's listening to snow." Next, he'll ask the dead how to build a house. Bram never looked up. Tova remained perfectly still, nose raised into the wind, while another block of what Bram quietly called winter's white timber slid onto the sled. However, when the actual work began, the first blocks came from the very ground where Bram intended to build. Each cut served two purposes. It supplied material for the walls, while slowly lowering the floor that would eventually become the cold sump. Everything went well until his blade reached a patch beside an old willow clump. The surface looked firm. The layer beneath was not. As Bram lifted the block, one corner collapsed into loose crystals and scattered across the snow. Jonas Pike had been watching from a distance. "That's your wall," he said, without a trace of mockery. "Looks like Winter already disagrees." Bram studied the broken edge for a few seconds instead of defending himself. Then he carried the damaged block to one side and broke it apart completely. Nolan looked confused. "Aren't we throwing it away? It'll still have work to do." The loose snow would later become packing material, pressed into narrow seams where solid blocks could never fit tightly enough. Without another word, Bram picked up the sled and headed back toward the wind-hardened ridge at Crow Knife Pass. Better snow was waiting there. For the first time, Mara caught a flicker of uncertainty in her husband's eyes. She said nothing. Instead, she bent down, gathered every handful of broken snow, and loaded it onto the sled beside the good blocks before quietly following him uphill. With the wall blocks piling up beside the site, Bram turned his attention to the ground beneath them. He dug the main floor into the frozen earth, then carried the entrance tunnel another 9 feet before bending it sharply to the right. Anyone crawling inside would first pass through the lowest point of the shelter before reaching the living space. The sleeping platform rose 22 inches above the main floor. Below it, the cold sump dropped another 28 inches, waiting for heavy air to settle where it could do the least harm. The floor itself became another project. Flat sandstone slabs covered the walking path around the firebox. Bram laid a loose lattice of willow branches across the sleeping shelf, leaving narrow gaps beneath it. Dry sedge, buffalo grass, and cattail reeds followed, each layer trapping still air instead of moisture. Thick buffalo hides covered everything at the end. Mara stepped onto the finished platform, stretched out beside Nolan, then measured the remaining space with her eyes before giving a quiet nod. 3 people could sleep there without touching the cold wall. When it came time to raise the walls, Bram took an approach that puzzled everyone watching. Instead of stacking neat horizontal rings, Bram trimmed the first course into a gentle upward slope. Every block that followed leaned against the one before it, while resting on the course below. The wall slowly climbed around itself, turning higher with each pass until the shape started closing overhead. Mara inspected every joint before handing him another block. Whenever she spotted a gap wide enough to catch a finger, Bram packed it with loose snow from the broken pieces he had saved earlier. Nothing was wasted. Nolan counted each block aloud until the numbers became too high to remember. Tova waited beyond the worksite, stretched across the packed snow with one eye on the sled as another hard wind swept over the ridge. Jonas Pike returned several times that afternoon. At first, he searched for weak spots. Later, he simply watched. Only a small opening remained at the top. Bram carved the final piece into a broad wedge instead of a square. Standing inside the nearly finished dome, he lifted the block through the opening, turned it sideways, then eased it down until it settled tightly against every surrounding edge. The weight shifted. Nothing moved. Jonas stepped closer without saying a word. He reached up, struck the dome with his knuckles, and listened. The sound came back low and solid. His eyes stayed on the roof, long after his hand had dropped. Across the shelter, Mara quietly looked up as well. For the first time, the rounded walls no longer resembled the grave everyone had mocked. They looked like a roof, waiting for a family to come home. When the curious onlookers finally drifted away, father and son sat together inside the newly sealed space. Bram handed Nolan his small tin cup. "Set one down there." The boy placed it inside the cold sump. Another cup rested beside him on the sleeping shelf. They sat and rested for a while. Less than an hour later, Nolan checked both cups. A thin skin of ice had already formed across the water below. The cup beside him remained completely unfrozen. A small grin crossed his face. Bram never explained why. The shelter itself had already done that for him. The first night inside the snow dome felt warmer than Bram had expected. That worried him more than the cold ever had. The small clay firebox rested on its sandstone hearth with a brighter flame than he intended. Dry willow burned quickly. Heat climbed through the shelter almost at once. Sometime before midnight, Mara stirred beneath the buffalo hides. She reached toward the edge of the blanket and frowned. The fabric felt damp. Across the shelter, Tova quietly rose from her place beside Nolan and settled several feet farther from the fire. The dog did not whine or pace. She simply chose a cooler spot. Bram noticed both changes at once. He knelt beside the firebox, pulled one burning stick away, and narrowed the lower draft until the flames settled into a slow, steady glow instead of a lively blaze. Silence returned. Morning revealed what the darkness had hidden. A thin shell of ice clung to the inside of the dome. Bram scraped it gently with the back of his knife and watched faint trails of frozen moisture trace their way toward the lower wall. A roaring fire would turn a snow house into rain. But a small, steady heat only softened the inner surface, just enough for the bitter cold outside to instantly freeze it into a solid shield of insulation. The shelter had not failed. His fire had. Cabins demanded big flames to fight the cold. Snow demanded patience instead. Mara pressed her hand against the damp edge of the blanket before looking at him. Not there again. She said nothing else. Bram nodded once, studying the frozen lines on the wall as carefully as he had studied the snow outside. The lesson had cost one wet blanket instead of a life, and he intended to keep it that way. The repair began before another fire was lit. Bram stretched heavy buffalo hides a few inches away from the snow wall instead of hanging them directly against it. Rawhide loops held each panel in place, leaving a narrow pocket of still air hidden behind the lining. Mara checked every section with her hand. She slipped her fingers behind the hides, searching for moisture. Nothing dripped back onto her skin. The damp blanket from the night before stayed dry. Outside, Bram shaped a clear block of river ice until it fit neatly into an opening on the eastern side of the dome. Morning light entered without forcing anyone to lift the entrance flap. The shelter filled with a pale blue glow that softened every corner. Before sunset, he scattered loose powder snow across the outside walls. The fine layer settled into tiny cracks and seams, sealing them beneath what the old trappers called a storm skin. The difference appeared gradually instead of all at once. Nolan's breath no longer frosted the buffalo hide within minutes after lying down. Tova stayed curled beside the firebox without shifting away from the warmth. Even the air felt quieter, as though it had finally found where it belonged. Nolan reached toward the blue light spilling through the ice lens and watched it dance across the curved ceiling. It looks like the river. Mara smiled without answering. Her eyes lingered on her son longer than the light itself. For the first time since they had climbed onto the northern slope, the future seemed just a little closer than the coming winter. Several days later, word had spread across Frostjaw Basin. Work slowed as settlers drifted toward the northern slope, curious to see the strange snow shelter that refused to collapse. Reverend Silas Morrow stood near the entrance, studying the rounded dome before speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. People were never meant to bury themselves before winter has the chance. A few heads nodded. Harlan Creed folded his arms. Truth is, Bram's already done winter's work for it. Built his own ice tomb. Laughter rolled through the crowd. Mrs. Elspeth Rowe, a young mother whose family lived near the South Creek, looked past Bram and fixed her eyes on Mara. A little boy needs a timber roof over his head, not a fox den. Tobias Wren, a proud rancher known for his fine red log cabin, stepped forward. A grown white man doesn't crawl through a snow tunnel to sleep. Bram never answered any of them. He simply crouched beside the entrance and trimmed another thin shaving from the tunnel wall, making the passage just wide enough to crawl through without disturbing the lower air pocket. Behind Mara, Nolan lowered his head as someone quietly muttered, "There's the little ice boy." He edged closer to his mother. After the crowd finally wandered away, Nolan looked up at Bram. "Pa, is it really a tomb?" Bram brushed loose snow from his gloves before meeting the boy's eyes. "Not if we keep learning." The first hard cold arrived before sunrise. By afternoon, The thermometer had fallen past -31 degrees Fahrenheit, and the north wind began pressing against every chimney in Frostjaw Basin. Inside the row cabin, the fire burned hot. The smoke did not leave. It rolled back through the stovepipe instead, spreading across the ceiling before sinking lower with every passing minute. Little Emily Rowe doubled over, coughing until her face turned pale beneath the soot. Tears streamed from her burning eyes. Elspeth threw open the door, but the fresh air outside only drove more smoke back inside. Sheriff Abel Rook carried the child from one cabin to another, searching for clean air. Every fire was burning harder. Every chimney fought the same wind. At last he climbed the northern slope and stopped before the low entrance Bram had carved into the snow. His fist struck the tunnel wall. Once. Bram pulled back the hide flap without a word. Mara spread another buffalo hide across the sleeping shelf, as Abel gently laid the coughing girl beside Nolan. A cup of hot broth soon warmed her trembling hands. The coughing slowly faded. Breathing became easier. Elspeth stood quietly near the entrance, her eyes moving across the buffalo hide, hanging a few inches away from the snow wall. She reached out with shaking fingers and touched it. "It's dry," she whispered. No one answered. Morning brought questions instead of arguments. Sheriff Abel Rook looked around the shelter before turning to Bram. "Why didn't the smoke trap you too?" Rather than explain, Bram placed one candle near the bottom of the entrance tunnel and another beside the sleeping shelf. He pulled back the entrance flap. The lower flame bent sharply toward the opening before flickering out. The candle above barely moved. Next, he handed Nolan a short strand of sheep's wool. The boy released it over the cold sump. Instead of drifting upward, the loose fibers slipped quietly into the hollow below. Jonas Pike watched every movement without interrupting. Only then did Bram speak. "The cold wants the lowest place." He glanced toward the hollow beneath the platform. "Give it one." No one argued. Jonas slowly folded his measuring tape and slipped it back into his coat pocket. For the first time since Bram began building on the northern slope, he walked away without searching for another flaw. The deeper cold emptied every dry woodpile in Frostjaw Basin. Soon, Harlan Creed had little left to sell, except freshly cut pine. People bought it anyway. The fires grew larger, yet the cabins felt no warmer. Thick smoke clung to the rooms while wet logs hissed beneath the flames. Then another problem surfaced. Inside Harlan's tightly stacked lumber shed, damp timber began heating from within. Thin ribbons of smoke escaped between the boards. Snow buried the outside, but a dull red glow still pulsed deep inside the pile. Bram watched in silence before speaking. "Wood needs air as much as fire does." Harlan lowered the axe in his hand. For the first time, he realized that more fuel meant very little when moisture and trapped heat had already turned against him. As more families copied Bram's shelter, mistakes appeared almost immediately. One dome collapsed because soft snow had been cut near the creek. Another sagged after its builder stacked level rings instead of following a spiral rise. Elsewhere, a firebox burned too high, leaving water dripping down the inside wall. One family stretched buffalo hides directly against the snow, trapping moisture until frost covered the back of the lining. Bram refused to rebuild anyone's shelter. He handed the tools back instead. Cut another block. Dig deeper. Measure it again. Nearby, Mara showed the women how to leave space behind every hide so still air could do its work. Jonas Pike quietly practiced laying a spiral course without asking for help. Children learned as well. One afternoon, a man who had once laughed at Bram crouched beside Nolan and asked, "Where does the cold go?" Nolan pointed into the cold sump. "Down there." The man nodded, picked up his shovel, and started digging again. By the middle of December, the northern slope no longer belonged to one family. 12 snow homes stood across the hillside. Some leaned slightly after hurried repairs. Others carried patches of bark, rawhide, or fresh storm skin where early mistakes had been corrected. None of them looked impressive. Most of them stayed warm. Each evening, thin ribbons of smoke rose quietly above the white domes, while thick gray clouds continued hanging over many of the log cabins below. Someone remarked that Bram had built a new village. He shook his head. "We earned another night." That was all he said. Mara spent her mornings helping mothers replace damp bedding, rearrange sleeping shelves, and keep the hides away from the snow walls. Between the shelters, Tova pulled bundles of buffalo hides and dry sedge from one family to the next without needing a command. One afternoon, Reverend Silas Morrow climbed the slope again. He stopped outside Bram's entrance tunnel for several moments before speaking. "A widow lost her husband 2 winters ago," he said quietly. "She has a newborn son." His eyes settled on the ground instead of the dome. "Would you show me how deep the cold sump should be?" Bram reached for his shovel. Together they walked downhill. As they passed through the settlement, nobody called the shelter an ice tomb anymore. No one had found another name for it yet either. Nature wouldn't leave them be. Old Nels noticed the change before anyone else. "Crow knife is sharpening," he murmured. By dusk, Tova lifted her head and let out a long, uneasy howl. Minutes later, the wind struck. Snow swallowed the hillside so completely that a person could disappear after 40 steps. Then someone shouted for help. A young family's newly built dome had taken a heavy tree branch across the roof. The impact tore open part of the storm skin and twisted the chimney collar loose. Bram grabbed his snow knife, a roll of rawhide, and disappeared into the white wall with Tova running ahead. Behind him, Nolan reached for his coat. "I can help." Mara caught his arm before he reached the entrance. "You already are." She rested his hand on the firebox draft. "Small. Keep it small." Outside, the storm erased every landmark. Only Tova seemed to know where the damaged shelter waited. By the time Bram sealed the torn roof with fresh snow and rawhide, the draft had steadied again, and the frightened family inside could finally breathe without watching the ceiling. The wind left before sunrise. Its work remained. Sheriff Abel Rook followed a trail of footprints leading away from a log cabin. They faded little by little, until nothing remained except a child's wool scarf frozen against a fence post less than 70 yards from home. Nobody needed to say what had happened. Back on the northern slope, every snow dome was checked before breakfast. Bram never mentioned being right. He knelt instead and used a charred stick to draw a rough map across the snow. One mark for each shelter, another for every cabin. A small circle, wherever children were sleeping. Mara quietly added names beside the circles, while volunteers prepared to visit every home before nightfall. Nolan studied the map for a long moment. Why did the children come first? Bram looked across the silent basin before answering. Because grown men usually get more chances to be foolish. No one argued. Nature had already finished the discussion. A meeting was called that evening inside Tobias Wren's red-painted cabin. Every bench was filled. The stove burned hard enough to make the iron glow, yet the room still carried the sharp smell of smoke trapped beneath the rafters. Tobias stood first. "We crossed a continent to build homes," he said. "Now grown men are crawling into snow holes like animals. If that's progress, winter has already beaten us." Several people lowered their eyes. Jonas Pike finally answered, "It isn't the shape of the shelter that's keeping families alive." Tobias cut him off. "A man who can't build a real wall shouldn't be teaching other men how to live." Every face turned toward Bram. He remained seated. Before he could reply, Mara slowly rose. She never raised her voice. Instead, she looked directly at Tobias. When the smoke drops to the floor, she paused. "Where will your daughter sleep?" The question stayed in the room long after the words ended. No one reached for an answer. Even the fire seemed quieter. Reverend Morrow looked toward the blackened stovepipe. Sheriff Abel Rook stared at the frost gathering around the window frame. Tobias opened his mouth once, then closed it again. Across the room, Bram watched Mara settle back onto the bench beside him. Until that moment, he had believed she trusted him because she trusted her husband. Now he understood something deeper. She trusted the measurements. She trusted the lessons the winter had already written across the basin. By the end of January, survival depended on far more than warm walls. Game had grown scarce. Flour sacks felt lighter each week. Even the careful families could no longer spare dry firewood. That was when Bram began treating the snow settlement as a living system instead of a collection of shelters. Every morning started the same way. The dirty snow around each entrance was scraped away and replaced with clean powder. allowing more light through the tunnel while keeping odors from building inside. Waste was carried well beyond the last dome, before fresh snow covered the paths again. Old Nels showed the younger men where dry sedge still hid beneath frozen marsh grass. New bedding replaced damp layers before they had time to freeze. Near the low smoke vents, thin strips of rabbit and venison hung above slow fires, drying gradually instead of cooking. Tova and the other dogs became part of the routine as well. They followed fresh coyote tracks, found frozen carcasses buried beneath drifting snow, and hauled small bundles back to camp on light sleds. The settlement changed without anyone announcing it. People stopped asking how to build a snow home. They started asking how to keep one healthy. One afternoon, a shaft of pale blue light slipped through an ice lens and danced across the curved ceiling, while a small child laughed beneath it. Nobody called the sound hope. No one needed to. The cold reached its final measure that night. Outside the entrance, the thermometer settled at -58 degrees Fahrenheit. Crow Knife Pass no longer howled across the basin. The air had become so bitter that even the wind seemed to surrender its voice. Frostjaw Basin lay beneath a silence that felt heavier than any storm. Inside the dome, Bram fed the firebox only 2 willow sticks no thicker than his wrist. Beside them, a small tallow lamp burned with a quiet yellow flame, nothing more. Too much heat would become another enemy. The floor remained bitterly cold. The cold sump held air that seemed almost alive in its hunger. Yet the raised sleeping shelf stayed between 35 and 37 degrees, never comfortable, never safe by ordinary standards, but warm enough to keep life from slipping away. Mara slept with Nolan, between herself and Tova. The dog's thick coat covered one of the boy's small hands. Bram did not sleep. Every few minutes he listened. The dome answered with faint creaks as the snow settled beneath the weight of another freezing hour. The king block held. The storm skin hardened. No water formed beneath the buffalo hides. No smoke drifted back into the shelter. The system simply kept doing exactly what it had been built to do. Near dawn, Nolan turned in his sleep. His fingers remained tucked beneath Tova's warm fur. Bram watched that small hand for several seconds. Then he quietly looked away. There would be time to feel something after winter finished passing judgment. Tonight, the only thing that mattered was making sure the next breath came as easily as the last. Morning arrived without color. Sheriff Abel Rook started his rounds before the sun climbed above the eastern ridge. Cabin after cabin told the same story. Black, soot-stained ceilings where smoke had refused to leave. Several doors had frozen shut after moisture turned to ice around their frames. People inside answered slowly, their voices thin with exhaustion. The northern slope looked different. One by one, low entrance tunnels opened. Men crawled out first, brushing loose snow from their coats. Mothers followed with bundled children close against their chests. Thin columns of smoke continued rising from the snow homes, quiet and steady. Nobody cheered. Surviving a night like that left little strength for celebration. The last figure to appear came from the southern trail. Tobias Wren walked uphill, carrying his daughter beneath a wool blanket. Smoke had darkened his face, and the pride that once filled his voice had disappeared somewhere during the night. He stopped in front of Bram's shelter. Neither man spoke. Tobias simply looked toward the narrow entrance. Bram stepped forward, knelt beside the tunnel, and widened the opening with 2 careful cuts of his snow knife before pulling back the buffalo hide flap. That was invitation enough. Mara welcomed the little girl onto the sleeping shelf and wrapped another warm hide around her shoulders. Nolan quietly shifted closer to Tova, making room without being asked. No apology was offered. None was expected. Outside, the basin stood silent beneath another pale morning, and every person watching understood that winter had already delivered its verdict. March arrived one slow afternoon at a time. The storm skins softened beneath the sun. Water began dripping from the entrance tunnels. The clear river ice lenses that had filled each shelter with blue winter light cracked quietly before melting back into ordinary water. One by one, the snow homes started returning to the earth. No one tried to save them. No one tore them down, either. Families simply walked around the settling domes, with the quiet respect usually reserved for old graves or weathered churches. They understood those walls had never been meant to last beyond winter. Bram watched the roof of his own shelter sink a few inches and showed no disappointment. Nearby, Mara carefully removed the buffalo hides, folded every dry piece, and stacked them for another season. Nolan wandered to the center of the dome and picked up the softened king block before it disappeared into slush. "Did our house die?" he asked. Bram smiled faintly. "No." He rested a hand on the melting wall. It finished its work. Across Frostjaw Basin, the lesson continued in other forms. Jonas Pike stopped building tall log cabins on exposed ground. His next homes were tucked into south-facing hillsides with low entrances, raised sleeping platforms, and small clay stoves that favored steady heat over roaring fires. Harlan Creed changed the way he sold wood. Instead of boasting about larger piles, he built open drying racks that let air move freely through every stack before winter arrived. The following Sunday, Reverend Silas Morrow spoke about endurance, wisdom, and humility. For the first time, he never once called the snow shelters ice tombs. No one in the congregation did, either. By then, everyone understood that the true shelter had never been snow alone. It had always been the knowledge hidden inside it. Spring settled gently over Frostjaw Basin. Grass returned where drifts had once buried the earth, and the sound of running water slowly replaced the long silence of winter. Children wandered farther from the cabins each day, no longer measuring every step against the cold. One evening, Sheriff Abel Rook found Bram repairing a harness beside the shed. "The settlement wants someone to lead," he said. "They're asking for you." Bram kept working. After a moment, he shook his head. "They don't need another leader." Abel waited. "I only noticed the wind a little sooner than everyone else." Nothing more was said. Weeks later, the families who had survived gathered outside on a mild spring evening. Small clay stoves burned with quiet flames, while supper simmered in black iron pots. Conversation came easily now. Children laughed. Tova slept beside Nolan, one ear lifting now and then before settling again. Someone across the circle finally asked the question that had lingered since winter. "What do you call the thing you built?" The answer did not come right away. Bram looked toward Mara. She was watching Nolan carve little blocks from a scrap of willow, stacking them into a tiny spiral dome while Tova rested beside him. His eyes stayed there for a long moment. Then he spoke. "A borrowed winter." The words puzzled a few people at first. Bram smiled faintly. "You never defeat winter." He reached down and turned one of Nolan's wooden blocks with a fingertip. "You only borrow enough warmth to make it to spring." No one argued. There was nothing left to prove. The snow homes had vanished. The measurements remained. The lessons remained. Families carried them into every new house they built, whether the walls were snow, earth, or timber. Long after the last dome had melted away, the wind still crossed Crowknife Pass exactly as it always had. The difference was that, now, someone knew how to listen before it spoke. Nature had never lost. It had simply allowed those willing to learn to pass through another winter alive.